Hello, BookTube. Today I'd like to do a book tag. I saw Steve Donahue do, and I thought it was fascinating. And it's an original book tag to Mrs. Hembry Reads. So when he did the tag, and I got to go back and see Mrs. Hembry's Reads BookTube channel. It's wonderful. And it's called "It's Not Fall Here" book tag. As Mrs. Hembry Reads points out, a good portion of BookTube is comprised of booktubers from the United States, England, and although I do follow quite a few New Zealand and Australian booktubers, but anyhow, and it's a very good point. But Steve adapted it while giving recognition to the fact it was trying to highlight the fact that not everybody lives in the Northern Hemisphere. Steve adapted it to his home country, which is Boston. And obviously he's a resident of the United States, but there's regional particularities to where all of us live, and many of us have lived many places. But I'm going to do the same as he did because I did find it interesting, with the recognition of the fact that there's folks who don't live in the Northern Hemisphere and do live in other cultures, and I'd love to hear what their answers to this tag are. But my particular country, the first question is, where are you from? Well, I'm from Vermont. My family's lived here for centuries, since the late 1700s, early 1800s. I'm of English and French descent, and some Irish, which is very typical in this part of New England. My wife is from Massachusetts, and she's of Portuguese descent, which is very typical there in the Cape area and New Bedford. And she's from Quincy. So we're a very New England family, but in my own case, it's primarily Vermont. So although I've lived other places, I've lived in Boston, I've lived in Maine for many years. But we'll stick with Vermont for the purposes of this tag, and that's where I live now. So a book written by an author from your country. So for this I chose Disappearances by Howard Frank Mosher, one of Vermont's great writers. He just died last year. He has a new book coming out, I think, in January. But this is Disappearances, and it's one of my favorite novels of his. It's Viking Press, New York. This was 1977. Part New England Gothic, part fantasy, and pure rollicking adventure story, Disappearances traces the history of a unique clan of hardy Vermonters who have survived in Kingdom County, which is his fictional setting for a lot of his works, near the Canadian border for several generations. In the fall of 1976, Judge William Wild Bill Bonamy finds everything around him disintegrating, so he turns to his past and relives the critical days full of terror, full of wonder. The time is 1932, just before the repeal of Prohibition and just after Wild Bill's 14th birthday. His father, Quebec Bill, undertakes to raise the money he desperately needs to see his cows through the last of the long winter by returning to the family trade, whiskey smuggling. And you see the cover art there, it's just wonderful. I have a long history with the Northeast Kingdom. My dad lived there for many, many years. Disappearances, Howard Frank Mosher. So the next question is a children's book from your country. And I don't read a lot of children's books, and not usually particularly Vermont children's books, but I am a public librarian, and I'm not a children's librarian, but there is a book about children's book that's put out by the Vermont Humanities Council, and it's very helpful to me. And it's called A Guide to Fiction Set in Vermont for Children and Young Adults. It's quite a comprehensive thing. It's Vermont Humanities Council, and it was published in, let's see here, 2008. So it has summary descriptions, picture books and easy readers, children and young adult fiction, resources. So it'll have appendices of authors and titles by age group, genres, authors and titles by publication date, authors living in Vermont past, present, Vermont Children's Book Awards. One of the big ones here is the Red Clover Award, and then there's the Dorothy Canfield Fisher Award. So that would be what I'd use for children's books. A book from your country you were forced to read in school. And this one really fired up my imagination. And it's a little brochure, really, more than a book. And it's called The Story of Old Vermont in Pictures. Right here. And here's the back. These are the typical types of images. This is put out by the National Life Insurance Company in Montpelier. And I absolutely loved it as a kid. Very, this is my hometown. So, made me feel connected to the land. Maple sugar. So, the next one is a book representing something that frustrates you about your culture or country. And this is a Howard Frank Mosher again. It's a Stranger in the Kingdom. Another wonderful, wonderful novel. And Vermont has an interesting history in regard to the greatest issue of American life, and that's slavery and racism. And Vermont was the first state admitted to the original 13 colonies. They'd been geographically part of those colonies for a long time, but as a separate state, and it even was a separate republic for a while. And when they did their constitution, they forbid slavery, and they were the first part of the United States to do that. And sometimes that can be awful comfortable to refer to when it doesn't give the whole picture. And I'll read you a little bit about what Mosher does with this. So Kingdom County is his fictional county, as we've already mentioned it. It's the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, and it's still a very unique place. Kingdom County, Vermont is tucked between the Green Mountains and the White Mountains, not far from the Canadian border, a small town of proud people with long memories. When the new preacher, Walter Andrews, comes to town, he was an outsider, a stranger. He was also a black man. It was the summer James Kinnison turned 13. Son of the newspaper owner and younger brother of the town's fiery defense lawyer, James witnesses the shattering events that would tear the town apart. A brutal murder and the trial of a man, not so much for what he might have done, but for what he was. A Stranger in the Kingdom is a powerful drama of the passion, prejudice, and innocence suddenly lost and perhaps found again. So, yeah, it brings things, it focuses on uncomfortable things, so, which we don't always like to do here. Let's see. A book with weather similar to your hometown. Well, Robert Frost was a New England poet, but he's a very complicated life. He was born in California, lived much of his life in New Hampshire. He has huge connections with Massachusetts, and he lived much of his life here in Vermont. And you can visit a farm not far from where I am that he owned. So he was descended from an old New England family. So the weather here, when people think of Vermont, they think of the fall, the leaves, and they are beautiful, and they're a range of colors that you don't see many places. And this time of year we have an awful lot of folks, we call them leaf peepers, come up to watch the foliage. And this year it's awful warm, wet, humid, and the leaves are not changing the way they normally would. I'm looking at the window as I speak. But they'll get there. And Robert Frost loved the land, and a lot of his poetry reflects that. And I have here a book. It's called Robert Frost, A Pictorial Chronicle. And it is by Kathleen Morrison. It's Halt, Reinhardt, and Winston out of New York and San Francisco. It was published in 1974. Must have had a dust jacket at one time. It doesn't here. And it has a picture in here. The caption is, "It's knowing what to do with things that counts." And Frost loved the land. So here you have a typical Vermont fence, a typical Vermont stone wall, a wheelbarrow, and some firewood. And everywhere you go right now, you see people dealing with firewood. So getting ready for the winter. So I think that reflects the weather here. A book with a cultural celebration you feel you miss out on. Well, my ancestors mostly came from an area of Vermont called Cabot. And if you folks in the United States who go to your supermarkets, you see Cabot cheese. That's produced by a co-op of farmers, which my family was instrumental part of and still are. But my own branch of the family moved from the hardscrabble farms of Vermont, although I grew up on a small hill farm. Moved into town. My father took regular jobs and eventually a new profession and left the farm life behind. But there's parts of me, I live in a very old farmhouse, but it's not a working farm. Part of me misses that connection to the land and connection to family. We moved out of Cabot to southern Vermont. So this book, First Person Rural, by Noel Perrin. You like that picture? It's Essays of a Sometime Farmer. And it's David R. Godine and publishers out of Boston. And this was from 1978. And this is Noel Perrin's discussion of that life. He was also a teacher and all that. So he wasn't a full-time farmer, but a lot of what he speaks of is similar things to what I grew up with. So there's that. The next question is, a book originally written in your first language. Well, this is New England, and I speak English. Like I say, I'm descended from just as many French folks and some Irish. I don't speak French or Gaelic, but English is my first language, so and only language. I wish I spoke more. And I live not far from Montreal, which is the second largest speaking French city in the world. But here in New England, even though a lot has changed, it's not the same as it used to be. But the King James Version of the Bible, and here's Perry Miller, The Life of the Mind in America. He's very, very famous for a series of books. There's 2 volumes that were The New England Mind, the 17th Century, and The New England Mind from Colony to Province. Here, and you still see it, I grew up not far from one of the oldest meeting house in Vermont. Very, very Puritan. We were settled by folks from Connecticut and Massachusetts, mostly Connecticut. And so all around you, you can see the culture of the Puritans and the early Protestant families who moved north. That being said, having French ancestry also, you can see the movement of Catholic churches. But the church and the common ground in the middle of town is what these towns up here are built on. And while much has changed over the centuries, it still exerts an influence. So, being probably the oldest book that had a huge influence, that's what I chose. A book depicting a cultural celebration festival that you love. Now, when I was a little boy, I used to go maple sugar, and it was hard work, and it was muddy, it's messy, it's the springtime of the year. So for this, I chose Backyard Sugaring, 3rd edition, revised and expanded by Rink Man, photographs by Daniel Wolf, and this was the Countryman Press out of Woodstock, Vermont, right up the road here. And this is just simple ways for you to do sugaring in your backyard, which an awful lot of folks around here do. And then something you wish the world understood about your culture. Well, for that I chose something that gives brief descriptions of our culture here and our history, and that's the Vermont Encyclopedia. Got a covered bridge that I've actually videotaped on this site because it's right down the road. That's the longest one here. That's actually a bridge between Windsor, Vermont, and New Hampshire. But this encyclopedia has everything. Here's an article: Coast Guard on Lake Champlain, the flood of 1927, John Henry Hopkins, Mount Mansfield, a maple sugar house in Vermont. So it gives you an overview of important people, history, industry, agriculture, everything to do with Vermont. So it's edited by John J. Duffy, Samuel B. Hand, and Ralph H. Orth. And this was published by the University Press of New England in Hanover and London. And it came out in 2003. So that is the It's Not Fall Here book tag, an original tag to Mrs. Hembry Reads, and was done by, I found it through. So the last thing to do is to tag some folks. I actually would like to tag anybody's interested in this. If you're in the northern part of the world, you need to adapt it a little bit. And if you're in a place where it's not fall now or autumn, then that would be wonderful to hear too. So thank you, BookTube.